Alright, so boom. Personally, I think the Ultimate Marvel Universe needs to come back. The reasons as to why are pretty simple and plain, so I'm gonna try to keep this as short as possible. And just to be clear, this is my own personal opinion, so there's no obligation to agree with me.
Obviously.
But of course, this is the internet, and some people like to argue just for the sake of it, and they'll be like, well, it's your opinion, but you're still wrong. And I'll just say, shut your stupid. Now, back in the day, and by back in the day, I mean basically everything that happened before the 2015 Secret Wars event, Marvel Comics was a lot more vast and expansive. I mean that in the sense that it felt like there was a lot more in it, from characters to alternate universes. Not to mention, back in those days, Marvel wasn't afraid to tap into the darker elements of the comics with the darker and grittier characters. Stuff like Marvel Max was a more adult-themed version of the character stories that didn't pull punches like with the mainline comics, because, you know, the mainline comics were trying to be a lot more family-friendly. I mean, hell, even the mainline comics didn't shy away from stuff that was pretty dark, even if it wasn't as explicit as like Marvel Max. But nowadays, you have to like really dig deep to find the gloves off type stories, and even then, it only gets dark to a certain degree. But back then, there were comic titles that were kid friendly, others that were more geared towards teens, others for adults, and others that pretty much anybody can enjoy regardless of age group. Even the Marvel multiverse seemed more alive than it does now, which brings us to the Ultimate line of Marvel Comics. Now, the entire premise of the Ultimate Comics was to basically put a modern take on Marvel superheroes. Mind you, this was back when modernizing didn't mean to make something stupid and goofy in an attempt to be hashtag relatable or subvert expectations. You know, like how they take older cartoons and then quote unquote modernize them for a younger generation, only to end up getting canceled after just one season because nobody asked for that shit. Remember that Powerpuff Girls reboot? Yeah, me neither. Anyway, the Ultimate Comics were meant to depict Marvel heroes through a more modern lens. Basically, it was the question of what would happen if all the Marvel superheroes and supervillains showed up like right now in the modern day. Well, back then the modern day was like 2003, 2004 type shit. So basically, Peter Parker becomes Spider-Man in the early 2000s as opposed to the 1960s. Captain America is revived 60 years later as opposed to like a couple of decades later, sometime after World War II. Thor comes to Earth at a later point in time, the Avengers are created at a later point in time, and so on and so on. And not only was the Ultimate line meant to put the superheroes in a more modern setting, but it also served as a way to cut out a lot of the fluff that the original 616 universe was filled to the brim with. Basically, it was meant to make things less convoluted and easier to understand for brand new readers who wanted to get into comic books without having to read over like 60 plus years of previous comic book lore from the 616 universe just to understand what was going on with the superheroes and their stories. And for a while, it actually worked out pretty well. I mean, shit, the MCU is heavily based on much of the Ultimate Universe. Now, of course, it's still got some 616 in the mix, but it's closer to the Ultimate line because of how they went with a more modern day and real world spin on the stories. See, the thing about the Ultimate Comics is that, unlike the 616 universe, they weren't afraid to do something different. And by different, I mean go against the status quo. And by go against the status quo, I mean they actually allowed the characters to progress and the storylines to actually have long-lasting consequences on the story, as well as the characters going forward. With the 616 universe, regardless of how cataclysmic of an event takes place, eventually everything goes back to the way things were as if the event never occurred in the first place. Even if the entire world got destroyed, it's still back to business as usual. Characters that get killed don't stay dead. Well, unless you're Uncle Ben or Bruce Wayne's parents. Massive events that realistically should change the status quo only end up being a minor inconvenience at the most in the grand scheme of things. All in all, nothing truly matters in the long run. Nobody cares when superheroes die because in about 6 months to a year, they'll be right back with a full gallon of milk. Back like they never left, which is like the reverse of G4 TV because them motherfuckers left like they was never back.
Get 'em.
But see, in the Ultimate Marvel Universe, when characters died, they stayed dead. It wasn't no miraculous revival or they just randomly came back to life through sheer willpower or some goofy shit. When it was curtains, it was curtains. Not to mention the events that caused mass amounts of destruction had actual long-lasting consequences on everybody. They didn't just magically rebuild destroyed cities and houses and shit overnight. There was a legit reconstruction period over the course of several comics. It was a lot more believable and a lot more immersive, even if you weren't that much of a comic book fan, because it felt like a world that was a lot more tangible despite the fantastical shit that goes down. However, I'm not gonna sit up here and act like every single thing that the Ultimate Comics did was just the business. Galactus, because there's plenty of gripes I had of my own. Like for example, Galactus being a legion of robotic drones that attack worlds with flesh-eating viruses, as opposed to like a giant humanoid looking dude in a purple suit on a spaceship that sends a herald to each world to warn them before he gets there to destroy the planet and consume its energy. Though what the Ultimate Comics did with Galactus was almost as bad as like the giant cloud from the second Fantastic Four movie. How the hell are you gonna show the silhouette of Galactus's head on Saturn and then show a big ass cloud when he gets to Earth? And then they made T'Challa a mute, which was some bullshit, on top of the fact that the Ultimate Universe version of Wakanda is a much lesser version of Wakanda than the one from 616, meaning they weren't nearly as advanced, which explains why they couldn't fix T'Challa's vocal cords. And then there's the whole thing with mutants being a result of some lab experiments as opposed to a genetic mutation that manifested since the dawn of humanity, among other things. But the reason I mention all of this is because of the fact that at the end of the day, the Ultimate Marvel Universe had established itself as its own thing. Therefore, they weren't hindered by the need to stick to the status quo of the 616 universe. Legacy characters are damn near impossible to logically exist within the main Marvel universe. The reason why is simply because of the fact that not only are the original characters still around, it's quite clear that they're not going anywhere. Peter Parker will always be Spider-Man. They're not gonna permanently kill him off or age him out, let him get married and start a family and retire, or at least let Peter Parker start getting some fucking money, since realistically he should not still be poor. But you know, they gotta keep him poor for the sake of the status quo. Tony Stark will always be Iron Man, Steve Rogers will always be Captain America, T'Challa will always be Black Panther, Thor will always be Thor. None of the original characters will have a definitive ending for their stories. There's always going to be some new costume and as a result some new toys to sell, along with other types of merch. Not to mention, people will never not complain about a permanent change taking place in the 616 universe. So the best way for these legacy characters to actually exist and thrive on their own would be to place them into a separate reality. Just think about it, right? If we take all, and I mean all of the legacy characters, and put them into a separate reality where they can be the superhero as opposed to the other version of that other superhero that's still around and very much still young and active and in their prime, then there will be less confusion as to who the hell you're talking about when you mention a certain character that has the same name as another character that's still around. Basically, the idea goes like this. You have a massive event that ultimately results in a split between the original characters and the legacy characters. You place the legacy characters in their own separate reality. However, you let it be known that a version of those characters who are native to the 616 universe still exist there, but as of right now, they have no superpowers and they're just living their lives as regular people. Eventually, those legacy characters will get their superpowers and take over the role of the original characters when the OGs either get too old and they retire or they end up dying off, which of course we all know is never going to happen. But it's a way to let the audience know, yeah, these characters are still around and they will eventually one day take up the quote-unquote mantle, you know, since they got to turn everything into a damn mantle nowadays, even people's actual names and shit. But meanwhile, in this separate universe, you create this narrative that everything that occurred in the 616 universe also occurred there, but the original heroes are long since dead or retired, and these legacy characters are now the superhero of that universe. This way you can call Miles Morales Spider-Man instead of having to keep on saying Miles Morales Spider-Man or Black Spider-Man. Hell, you could even say Ultimate Spider-Man. To be honest, it does get pretty damn annoying having to always say Miles Morales just so that you know that we're talking about Miles Morales and not Peter Parker when we say Spider-Man. I mean, shit, Marvel couldn't bother to give Miles Morales his own damn superhero name, or at least one that didn't suck. It's like with Spider-Woman, right? You have Jessica Drew, the original Spider-Woman, at least I think she is. And then you got a bunch of copycats that nobody really cares about. I mean, even the alternate universe Gwen Stacy, who was called Spider-Gwen, but then she eventually became known as Ghost Spider. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's no need to say Gwen Stacy Spider-Woman. Or even with like Cindy Moon, who's known as Silk. But there's no need to call her Cindy Moon Spider-Woman or Korean Spider-Woman. She's just Silk. Even if most people automatically think about Peter Parker in this new universe, the fact is, in this alternate universe, Miles Morales is the Spider-Man of that universe. In the Ultimate Spider-Man comic books, as well as the Spider-Verse movie, there was a Peter Parker Spider-Man in those universes, but those Spider-Men died and their stories were finished, or at least that was the case for Into the Spider-Verse. Anyway, the point is, Miles Morales became the Spider-Man of that universe after Peter Parker was completely out of the picture. Now, going back to the idea of this separate reality, you can even have that universe operate on a sliding time scale like the 616 universe, where it doesn't exactly operate in real time, but it kind of does, but not really. I mean, like, you know, the superheroes can go on about their own stories without any relation or confusion with the original characters in 616. Now, of course, there will be people who will complain that this alternate universe doesn't have the original characters from the original universe, but you can just tell them to just go and check out the 616 comics that will still be ongoing if they'd rather see the originals. But like them or hate them, characters like Miles Morales do have a legit fan base that wants to see more of their stories, and that way they can just go and check out those comics to enjoy his stories. If most people end up liking this change, then it makes no sense trying to capitulate to this very loud minority who doesn't like this change when the overall majority actually appreciates the change because it simplifies things. Now, I'm not saying that my solution to the problem is the definitive answer, but it's just something I feel would help as well as be an interesting change in Marvel Comics. Maybe even with DC as well, but then again, I'm just fantasizing about a version of Marvel that doesn't exist anymore. Not to mention, current year Marvel is currently under a certain type of management that simply wouldn't allow for certain things to happen in Marvel Comics that used to be perfectly okay to happen in Marvel Comics. But that's just my 2 cents. Let me know what y'all think, and we could chop this shit up in the comment section. Peace.